Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, there were two handouts. The one on the 5 hindrances is only for people who didn't receive it earlier. At an earlier point in discussing this chapter, when I came to the section on the 5 hindrances, we gave out this handout. So probably most of you have it already. Therefore, this time I only had 10 copies made of that. And then the other handout is the 7 factors of enlightenment. Okay, so now we continue with our discussion on, we are in the chapter on mastering the mind. This is chapter 8, and we've been discussing the Satipatthana Sutta. And last time I did the sections on the 5 hindrances and on the 5 aggregates. So now we come to the section on the 6 sense bases. Okay, so now we come to the text that says, again, a monk dwells contemplating phenomena in terms of the 6 internal and external sense bases. Okay, so the Pali word that's translated as sense bases is ayatana. Okay, this is a word that's sometimes translated as spheres, spheres or bases. And these are the 6 we distinguish into 2 kinds, internal and external. And I think the best way to understand this particular doctrinal category is the best way to understand it is as the 6 sense faculties, the 6 sense organs, which are the internal basis for the arising of consciousness, and their corresponding objects, which are the external conditions for the arising of consciousness. So very often in the text, when the Buddha is describing how consciousness arises, he says, independence upon the eye and forms, there arises eye consciousness. Independence upon the ear and sounds, there arises ear consciousness, and so on through to the 6th relationship, independence upon, we come across a little tricky problem, independence upon the mind and dhammas, there arises mind consciousness. That is the internal, reflective type of consciousness. Okay, so from this formula, it seems clear, at least to me, that the text is speaking about 6 objects and 6 faculties or sense organs, which together form the basis for the arising of consciousness. But now, there's a little bit of a discrepancy, let me call this a discrepancy or tension between between the understanding of the sense bases, which is suggested just by reading the suttas themselves, and the way the sense bases come to be interpreted in the Abhidhamma and the commentaries. And this is because there is a statement that comes in the sutta, in some suttas, where the Buddha says, "Monks, I will teach you the all, or I will teach you everything, sabbang." And then he asks, and what is the all? The eye and forms, the ear and sounds, nose and odors, tongue and tastes, the body and tactile sensations, and the mind and dhammas. This, O monks, is the all, or this is everything. Okay, now if one takes this literally, it seems to be saying that all existing phenomena, everything that exists in any way, can be included in these 12 categories. Okay, so therefore I think this starts already in the Abhidhamma, it starts already in the Abhidhamma, and then it continues in the commentaries. They take mind here, manayatana, the mind base, to include all 6 types of consciousness, because these 12 things have to include everything. So all the types of consciousness go in the mind base. And then the Dhamma base, Dhammayatana, comes to include the aggregates of feeling, perception, mental formations, volitional formations, and certain aspects of the form aggregate that are not involved in sense experience. So in this way, the scheme of the 12 sense bases is made to become all-inclusive, because the Dhammayatana, the Manayatana, the mind base, includes all types of consciousness, and the Dhammayatana, the base of dhammas or phenomena, includes the other mental aggregates that are associated with consciousness. But I find that sometimes, even the commentaries, when they're not being very careful about the way they're speaking or writing, speak of the 12 sense bases as if they are the 6 sense faculties and the 6 sense objects, those things that are the basis for the arising of consciousness. So they don't seem to hold so tightly to this interpretation of the 12 sense bases as including everything. Okay, but between these 2 ways of understanding, I prefer to follow what seems to be the position of the suttas, despite the sutta on the all, because the sutta on the all is followed immediately or very closely by another sutta which speaks about how in dependence upon the eye and forms there arises eye consciousness, in dependence upon the ear and sounds there arises ear consciousness, in dependence upon the mind and dhammas there arises mind consciousness. But if all of the consciousnesses were included in mana, in mind, then it wouldn't be necessary to say in dependence upon dhammas and mind there arises mind consciousness. Okay, so if we just adhere closely to the general position of the suttas, The 12 ayatanas, or 12 bases, are the six sense organs or sense faculties, and the 6 sense objects. And they are called bases because they're the bases for the arising of consciousness. Okay, now the training in gaining control over the senses, this is a very important part of the Buddhist meditative path. We see this already, we've seen this already when we discussed the passage on that gives the broad overview of the path, which deals with what I call the gradual training. Here we have, this is on page 246 of the book, where the Buddha is explaining how one practices restraint of the senses. On seeing a form with the eye, he does not grasp at its signs and features, since if he left the eye faculty unguarded, evil, unwholesome states of longing and dejection might invade him. So he practices the way of its restraint, he guards the eye faculty, he undertakes the restraint of the eye faculty. And then the same thing is said with regard to each of the other sense faculties and their respective objects. Okay, so control of the senses is an important part of the Buddha's path. But now the Buddha is, in the Satipatthana Sutta, is explaining how one can use the sense faculties themselves and their objects as objects of contemplation. And one does this by, the text uses the word, one understands the eye, or one knows the eye, one knows forms. So in each case one has to know the inner sense space, the outer sense space. This generally refers to a stage in contemplation where already one has developed a strong degree of concentration, mindfulness with regard to a basic meditation object. And now whatever arises through any of the senses, one becomes aware of that particular sense object and aware of the sense faculty through which the object arises. So if one expects this, in the case of sitting meditation, generally the sense bases that would be activated are the senses of hearing and touch, tactile sensations. So for example, if one is sitting and then one hears sounds, one will know I'm hearing sounds, or one will simply be aware of sounds, and one knows that the sounds are heard through the ear base. When one feels sensations in the body, one becomes aware that these sensations are just the tactile base, the base of tangible objects, and that the inner base, which is the condition for the arising, is the body faculty. But then the Buddha adds another phrase, an important phrase. He understands the fetter that arises dependent on both. So this is where an aspect of mental training comes in, because one has to understand not only the sense object and the sense faculty that experiences that through which one experiences that object, but one also understands the sangyojana, the fetter that arises dependent upon them. Okay, and what is that fetter? Here the commentaries generally they bring in explanation in terms of the classical list of 10 fetters. But I think this is going to an unnecessary extreme of complexity. Because other texts speak simply about the fetter that arises dependent on each of the sense objects and its sense faculty. They explain the fetter to be desire and attachment. Kama, it's Chandaraga. For example, there's the sutta that occurs in the Salayatana Samyutta, the connected discourses on the six sense bases. It's two monks are having a conversation, and one of them raises the question, is the I the fetter of forms, or is forms the fetter of the I? And then the other monk gives the answer, it's not the case that the forms are the fetter for the I, and it's not the case that the I is the fetter for the forms, but rather it's the Chandaraga, the desire and attachment that arises in the relationship between these two, in dependence upon these two. That desire and attachment, that is the fetter. That is the bond between them. And then the monk gives an example to illustrate this. He says, suppose one has a black bull and a white bull, which are joined together by a yoke. Then one might ask the question, is the white bull the fetter for the black bull, or is the black bull the fetter for the white bull? What is the answer? Okay, the answer is, it's first, negatively, it's not the white bull that is the fetter for the black bull. It's not the black bull that's the fetter for the white bull. But what is the fetter? The yoke that joins them. And then this monk who uses the illustration, he continues and he says, he takes the Buddha as the example. There is in the Buddha the I. The Buddha sees forms through the I, but for the Buddha, there's no fetter between the I and forms. And why is it the case that for the Buddha there's no fetter between the I and forms? Because he has no desire and attachment. And so the same thing is said with the ear and sounds, nose and odors and so on. Okay, so in a simple way, if we want to ask what is the fetter that arises dependent upon these pairs of internal and external sense bases, the simple answer is simply desire and lust. If one wants to get a little more complex, there's another way to answer. And this is in terms of 3 types of feelings and 3 types of underlying tendencies. Because what happens, when the I is present, forms are present, forms impinge on the I, there arises I consciousness, visual consciousness, seeing the forms. Then there's coming together of the I, the coming together of I consciousness with the forms through the I. This coming together or encounter is called contact. Then dependent on contact, there is feeling. Now this feeling can be of any of 3 primary kinds. It can be pleasant feeling, painful feeling, and the feeling that's neither painful nor pleasant, neutral feeling. And now, corresponding to each of these three feelings, there is a particular, we use the word anusaya, underlying tendency. Okay, so corresponding to the pleasant feeling, there's a tendency to arise, there's a tendency for, there's a tendency for desire or craving to arise. So this is what's called the underlying tendency to attachment, or the underlying tendency towards craving arises in relation to pleasant feeling. And when this underlying tendency to attachment arises, then it becomes the fetter that binds one to pleasant feeling. Okay, then the second type of feeling is painful feeling. So when painful feeling arises, it tends to awaken, to provoke the underlying tendency to aversion. Because one dislikes the painful feeling, one wants to get free from it. Or if one is expecting some painful situation, then there will arise fear and anxiety with regard to it. We would say that is also a manifestation of this underlying tendency to aversion. Okay, then when we undergo an ordinary neutral feeling that's not painful or pleasant, then we remain unclear about it, cloudy about it. Its real nature remains obscure to the mind, because one doesn't understand it, and especially because one doesn't understand it as something which is impermanent, which arises through conditions, ceases through conditions. And so in regard to this neutral feeling, the underlying tendency of ignorance or delusion is activated. And so each of these underlying tendencies becomes, you would say, a fetter or a bond that connects one to the sense object and the sense faculty, to the internal and external sense spaces. Okay, so when any of the fetters arise in relation to the sense object, if liking arises in regard to a pleasant object, aversion and dislike arise in regard to a disagreeable, painful object, if there's cloudiness and ignorance in regard to a neutral feeling, then one notes that particular fetter which is present. So that is knowing the fetter, understanding the fetter arising dependent upon them. Okay, but now one has to go deeper into this next stage in the contemplation of the sense spaces. Here we bring in the principle of conditionality, conditioned origination. He understands how the unarisen fetter arises and how the arisen fetter is abandoned, and how the abandoned fetter does not arise again in the future. Okay, understanding how the unarisen fetter arises. Here in the text we could find certain general indications of how any of these underlying tendencies arise. For example, the underlying tendency or the fetter of desire and attachment to pleasant objects arise, the Buddha, the texts say, because of unwise attention or careless attention. In fact, this is such an important term in relation to all of the fetters. I'll write the Pali. Okay, so this is a factor that underlies the arising of all of the fetters. Ayoniso manasikara, which means superficial attention, careless attention. I think I put this on the board. I explained it previously. Have I done so? In this class? No? You don't remember? Because I've done it in other classes, so my memory is blurred of which class I've explained it. Anyway, it's important to know this term because it's a very significant term. This term and its opposite, which is yoniso manasikara. But yoniso, one can't take it too literally. It means, let us say literally, it might mean something like superficial. Just attention or consideration that scratches the surface of things but doesn't go very deeply. Okay, so what causes the underlying tendency, the fetter of desire and attachment to arise, is unwise attention, careless attention to the pleasant feature of things, to the agreeable feature of things. And so when one experiences a pleasant sensation of any kind, one sees a pleasant form, maybe tastes, enjoys a pleasant taste, hears pleasant sounds, then one lets oneself be swept away by the pleasure provoked by that experience. And then when one lets oneself be provoked by the pleasure, one is swept away by the pleasure, and then that strengthens the bond of desire and attachment. And so this is, we can say, this is a general condition for the arising of desire and attachment, that is unwise attention to the pleasant feature of things. But everybody's psychology is a little bit different, and so each individual will have their own particular, say, dispositions, inclinations, tendencies that cause the fetter of desire and attachment to arise in regard to what is pleasant. And so when one practices this observation of how the fetter arises, one can't just give one general explanation that's applicable to everybody, but each one has to observe the workings of their own mind and see what is it that provokes the desire and attachment within oneself. Okay, then one comes to the fetter of aversion, of ill will. Okay, this arises again through unwise attention, but in this case it's unwise attention to the disagreeable features of things. So when one experiences pain or when one comes into contact with disagreeable situations, if one attends to them unwisely, carelessly, just in terms of the immediate impact that they make, then ill will and aversion will arise. And then in the third place, the fetter of ignorance or delusion. This arises simply because of careless attention to, well, especially to neutral feelings or to neutral situations. And especially not examining the neutral feeling carefully in terms of its arising and cessation. And again, as in the case of the fetter of attachment, each individual will have their own particular, say, complex of mental factors which causes ill will to arise towards particular situations, particular people, and their own particular complex of factors that cause delusion to arise. And so as one observes the workings of one's own mind and sees how the unarisen fetter arises, one comes to understand in more detail, more clearly, how particular factors within oneself cause these fetters to arise. Okay, then one has to apply this principle of conditionality. Again, going a little bit deeper, one sees how the fetter arises through particular conditions. Then one also sees how this fetter, when it arises, can be abandoned. One has to understand that. And so one has to understand what is the remedy, what is the antidote to overcome this fetter when it has arisen. And so when desire and attachment have arisen, how does one overcome them? Okay, one method, there are many different methods. One method, which is almost implied within the whole Satipatthana system, is simply to note the particular mental state that's arisen. We turn the mind on its pivot and turn the mental state, which is usually operating in the background of the mind, put it into the forefront and turn it into an object. So whatever arises, whether it's attachment, aversion, delusion, one simply contemplates it as a mental state. Here, this is very similar to the first few sections in Cittanupassana, contemplation of mind, where one is contemplating when one has a mind with lust. One knows I have a mind with lust. When I have a mind with aversion or hatred, one knows I have a mind with hatred. When I have a mind with delusion, I know that I have a mind with delusion. But now one is using this as a particular method, particular technique for abandoning or eliminating the arisen fetter. Another method that can be used is to apply the particular antidote to that fetter that's arisen. And so the Buddhist text will mention the antidote to desire and attachment, particularly sensual or sexual desire and attachment, is the contemplation of the impure nature of the body. The body is a compound of a combination or an assemblage of various organs, tissues, fluids, and so on. To abandon the fetter of anger and ill will, the development of loving kindness. and to abandon the fetter of ignorance, then just clear reflection, deep reflection and clear observation are to be applied. But it seems to me that if one uses those other methods, then one is stepping outside the framework of the Satipatthana system itself to use another method of meditation. If one is staying within the system of Satipatthana, then when a particular fetter has arisen, the method to be used to abandon it is simply to make it an object of observation. And as one observes that particular fetter, that particular mental state, one can be observing that it's a mental state subject to arising and ceasing. And so one is also seeing into the impermanent nature of that mental state. Okay, and then one understands, in the third place, how the abandoned fetter does not arise again in the future. And the way I would understand this is one understands that it's simply through the continued development of this method of practice that one can prevent this fetter from arising in the future. The commentaries bring in here the more technical way of explanation in terms of which particular path, which particular world-transcending path will eradicate which particular fetter. But I'm doubtful that was the original intention of the text. I think the original intention was one simply knows what are the particular factors that one finds to be effective for abandoning the fetter when it's arisen, and then through continued development and strengthening of those factors, one knows that one can prevent this abandoned fetter from arising again in the future. Okay, so this is to be applied in relation to all of to each pair of sense object and sense faculty. And then finally, we have tacked on here the refrain that he dwells contemplating phenomena and phenomena internally, externally, both internally and externally. Here I can resolve the problem of how one contemplates internally and externally. Externally refers to the external object, internally refers to the sense faculty. And then he dwells independent, not clinging to anything in the world. Okay, at this point I'll pause and then ask whether there are any questions. Yes, please.
You mentioned the neutral. I'm a little lost with the neutral.
About the neutral feeling.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm using this as a shorthand expression for what in Pali is called the feeling which is neither painful nor pleasant. Okay, so it's a feeling which, according to this expression, it's not a pleasant feeling, not a painful feeling, but it's a feeling that's in between those two extremes. Yeah, most of the time we're actually experiencing that feeling. But we become aware of feelings, generally we become aware of feelings only when we're experiencing something particularly pleasant or something particularly painful. The rest of the time is something like driving in neutral gear. You know, it's not like changing gears, but one is just continuing to drive at an even pace. So you're not aware that you're in a particular gear.
So that would be considered present.
Again?
That would be considered the present.
The
The
present.
now.
Well, in the present, any of the three feelings can exist. So if I'm experiencing a pleasant feeling, then I'm not then that pleasant feeling is present. Then I'm not experiencing the neither painful nor pleasant feeling. But when the pleasant feeling subsides, then I go back into neutral gear. Then it's the neither pleasant nor painful feeling. Okay, Richard.
You were talking about how an unarisen theta arises. You gave the three types of feelings, and when it came to this, I gave this neutral or neither pleasant or unpleasant feeling. I didn't quite get clear on what the unwise attention is. Is it unwise attention or inattention in that case?
You have a good point. I think here the unwise attention could be called inattention, since one is not. The reason why that delusion or ignorance persists is simply because one is not attending to it. Yeah, that's a good point.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Okay, you're wrong.
You mentioned the interpreting the internal and external. Anyway, you said that the internally is referred to the sense object. Sense faculty.
Right.
Externally sense object.
Yeah.
But wouldn't internally be consciousness? Because consciousness impinges upon the sense object through the sense faculty. So the contemplation should be on the consciousness.
The internal sense space is not the consciousness.
Right.
The internal sense space is that factor which pertains to one's own sentient organism,
Right.
which functions as the basis through which consciousness occurs.
So when we're contemplating Dharma,
Yeah,
the fourth
yeah.
foundation of mindfulness, wouldn't the internal foundation we're contemplating on be consciousness rather than the sense organ? Are we watching the organ itself, or are we watching the consciousness through that organ?
What one understands is that the consciousness arises in dependence upon the sense organ or sense faculty. One can't actually see the sense faculty itself. Because the sense faculty is not, say in the case of the eye, it's not the eyeball itself, but it's a particular type of organic matter within the eye which is sensitive to light. Perhaps in terms of modern physiology it would correspond to rods and cones. Somebody?
Yes. Yes.
And then in the case of the ear, what's meant by the ear faculty is not this particular protuberance out here, but it's a kind of material phenomena within the inner ear that is able to respond to sounds. What's meant by the nose is not this particular bowl coming out here, but it's a type of tissue or matter inside this and up here which is able to respond to sounds, which is able to odors, and then to transmit odors to the brain where it will be interpreted. And similarly with the tongue, again, it's not this particular, what do you call this? Anyway, the tongue is not simply this which I stick out, but it's maybe it would be the types of nerves on the surface which are able to respond to different tastes. And similarly, what's called the body is not just the whole body itself, but it's the kind of matter which is suffused throughout the skin and even up through the internal membranes, which is sensitive to different textures and tactile sensations. Okay, so this is what one has to understand.
But that's not my question, because the brain is not consciousness.
In fact, the brain, I have to say, when I introduce the expression the brain, that the function of the brain is not recognized as such in the Buddhist texts. I'm using a modern physiological explanation. But continue.
Right, so let's say cerebral function, our neurology was able to sense things, but that's not consciousness.
Right.
My question is that when we contemplate Dharma internally, are we supposed to concentrate on the consciousness or that particular senses that our brain interprets? The consciousness is what I have problem with. I don't know what it is.
Okay, the way I understand this, in practicing the contemplation of the six sense bases, one is not contemplating consciousness or mind as such, but one is contemplating how experience arises through sense objects and sense faculties. And then one wants to focus particularly on this issue of the fetter that arises through the sense faculty, in relation to the sense object, in order to understand how the fetter arises, how these arisen fetters can be eliminated, and then how the fetter that's abandoned can be terminated so that it doesn't arise again in the future. Okay. No, let's go away first. Okay.
Is unwise attention a kind of wrong perception? So it belongs to the aggregate of perception.
It's not classified in the aggregate of perception. In terms of the five aggregates in the suttas, it's actually not. There are no suttas which assign it to a particular aggregate, but if we just consider the contents of the particular aggregates, it would probably fall within the aggregate of volitional formations. Let's say unwise attention, it's connected to perception, but in itself it's not perception, but arises on the basis of perception. So it's a kind of, let us say it's a kind of reflection or consideration based upon perception. There's a question? Okay.
So the perception might be correct, but the interpretation is wrong.
My supposition is that at some point, even in the perception, there will be a certain distortion already introduced, which occurs at a very rudimentary or primitive level in the process of perception. And then that distortion in the perception forms the basis for the unwise attention or unwise reflection, unwise consideration.
Then we don't deal with the fundamental distortion of the perception itself, that is not considered
eventually that very rudimentary distortion of perception gets corrected through the development of panya, of wisdom. But at the level of removing the fetters, one has to replace the ayoniso manasikara, the unwise or careless attention, with yoniso manasikara, which means careful attention, careful consideration, wise consideration. In the back. Maybe it's good for those people whose names I don't know to please also mention your name.
Barbara.
Say again?
Barbara.
Oh, Barbara.
I understand the process.
Yeah,
My question is for the layperson,
yeah,
such as myself,
yeah,
because it appears that the Buddha is talking to monks
Yeah.
who are seeking enlightenment.
yeah,
But for the layperson to practice this and
Yeah.
eliminate pleasure and pain
yeah,
and
yeah,
delusion,
yeah.
it kind of, the feeling I get is that it leaves us in a flat line
You mean it makes demands that are
to
too
deal with
strong?
life,
Yeah.
you know, if you're raising a
Okay,
family.
yeah, I mean, this is a good point. Okay, this definitely is a practice, the way it's being explained here in this Satipatthana Sutta, as a complete system of meditative development. It's a practice which was designed for those living in a monastic context. So it doesn't mean that it's exclusively for monastic persons, for monks and nuns. But it can also be practiced to some extent by lay people, even to if one goes on a retreat, in a retreat situation, then one is adopting the lifestyle of a monastic person. And so then one has the opportunity to practice this pretty much fully the way it's explained in the sutta. But still, even if one doesn't have that opportunity, but just becoming acquainted with this system of practice and then trying to practice to some extent in one's day-to-day life will help one deal with the problems that arise in day-to-day life. Because, okay, the problems people have basically stem from if one whittles it down to the bare basics, the bare essentials, the problems come from excessive attachment, desire and craving on the one hand, then resentment, anger, aversion on the other. Then when the anger and aversion gets out of control, it turns into violence, hatred, destructiveness. Okay, so what one has to do for people to live a wholesome, peaceful life in the world, a life that's beneficial to themselves, beneficial to others, one has to remove at least the coarser forms of attachment and try to remove as much as possible ill will and resentment.
That's what I was thinking, that I just wanted to
Yeah.
clarify.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Your name again?
My name is Sandy.
Oh, Sandy, that's right.
I have a question. It's about last class we mentioned about a stream enterer
Yeah,
when he or she first sees the truth.
yeah.
He actually sees. So my question is.
He actually what?
Sees the truth.
Yeah.
My question is, does he or she see the truth through the eye faculties or through the mind faculties?
Oh, no, through the mind faculty. It's not something that one sees as a visible object.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, John.
You described attachment, craving is due to superficial attention, and likewise aversion, superficial attention or unwise attention, and ignorance comes from neutral feelings, which is no attention.
Yeah, yeah.
So all of these fetters relate to inadequate or absent attention. But surely
Inadequate or what? Or
absent
absent
or inadequate
Right, yeah.
attention. But what if one really examines the attachment?
Yeah.
I'm very interested in the Dhamma. Come here every time that I can.
Yeah,
It's not a superficial attachment
yeah,
or interest.
yeah,
So, and I know that can become a fetter.
yeah.
My point is, it seems that fetters can also be other than superficial.
Hmm.
And I wonder if you could comment on that. I mean, there are things,
I'm not quite sure that I caught the point.
all of the fetters that you described seem to derive from superficial
Right, yeah,
examination.
right,
But there can be other attachments that relate to something that's a deeper or maybe even a profound investigation.
yeah.
And I assume they still would be a fetter.
Okay, you mean like attachment to the Dhamma?
That's the truth of Dhamma.
Okay, yeah.
So that would still be a fetter. would
Okay,
it not?
okay.
So it just seems to me that all the fetters,
Yeah.
as you described, the three of them relate to superficial
Okay.
examination.
Yeah.
But that doesn't seem to be necessarily true, because
Okay.
some fetters can be derived from
Okay.
quite deep or profound.
Okay, okay. Yeah, there is a subtle fetter to the Dhamma in the sense of the Buddha's teaching, or fetter to higher states of meditation, and even a fetter to high states of experience of insight. Because what happens is that when one enters deep stages of samadhi, then there's a lot of bliss and peace, and so a fetter and attachment can arise in relation to that. Also, when one is developing insight, when one is gaining deep insights, a lot of pleasure and bliss arise accompanying those insights, and so subtle attachment can arise in relation to that bliss that accompanies the arising of insight. So definitely that is a fetter. And so one also has to turn the tables on that fetter by cutting it off. But this just comes through developing insight into that particular fetter, seeing that that insight is something which is impermanent, unstable, subject to change, that it's something which is conditioned, dependently arisen. And when one gains that insight, then the attachment to the states of whether it's samadhi or to the states of deep insight, that attachment will break off, and then one eliminates the fetter to these higher experiences that come through practice of the Dhamma. But let us say that at more basic level, one uses the enjoyment, even the attachment to the Dhamma, or the attachment to meditative states, as a tool for overcoming the attachment to lower experiences, lower enjoyments. Yeah, that's so. If you look at sutta number, let me see what it is, I think it's 106 in the Majjhima Nikaya. Or it could be, my memory isn't as good as it used to be. Could be 137. The Buddha speaks, Ananda at the end of the sutta says that after the Buddha has given a long exposition, he says that the Blessed One, the Buddha, has taught Nisaya Ogam Tariti. One crosses the flood in dependence upon one thing after another, which the idea is that one first uses a subtle state to eliminate a coarse state, then one uses a still subtler state to overcome that subtle state, and then still a subtler state to overcome that second degree subtle state. And in this way, one goes from the coarse to the subtle until one eliminates all of the fetters.
I think I've got it now. I think what was throwing me with the use of the word superficial, which implies that all fetters derive from superficial attention, but there are deeper states of attachment or fetters.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you've
But
answered the question.
even those fetters, we would say, derive from superficial attention. Okay. So I think I have to go on now because I want to finish the sutta today. Okay, so now we will pass on to the next section. This is this fourth subsection in contemplation of Dhammas. And if you remember last time, I said that it seems to me that there's a particular progression taking place in this section on contemplation of Dhammas. One begins with the 5 hindrances. The 5 hindrances are the obstacles to concentration and to insight. And so in order to open up the field of contemplation, one has to get past the 5 hindrances. Then when one overcomes the 5 hindrances, at least to some extent, then the field of contemplation opens up, the field for the development of insight. And this is to be done by contemplating experience either in terms of the 5 aggregates or in terms of the 6 internal and external sense bases. So this is where the practice of insight takes place in relation to the 5 aggregates or in relation to the internal and external sense bases. Now, as one is developing these contemplations, then the mindfulness is becoming strongly established, the power of insight is becoming better established, and so now these particular factors that one is bringing into the practice turn into bojjhangas, which means enlightenment factors. Okay, this word bojjhanga is a compound that derives from bodhi plus anga. Bodhi means enlightenment, anga means factor. And so when you combine bodhi plus anga, then you would get, in the first place, you would get bodhyanga, because when the I meets an A, the I turns into a Y. And in Sanskrit, this is the expression bodhyanga, bodhyanga. But in Pali, because it was based on spoken languages, this dhya sound, it's too difficult to speak. And so there's a tendency for it to change into a J, the JH sound, so it becomes bodhyanga. Sanskrit has a number of these particular, what do you call this, phonemes, sounds that are hard to articulate. Just dhya. And so the dhya turns into ja, so it becomes bojjhanga. So these are factors of enlightenment. And so I say that the factors of enlightenment start to emerge as the contemplation aimed at insight is developing momentum. We have these same factors can be present in earlier stages, but they're not yet bojjhangas, enlightenment factors. The way I would understand it is at a particular point when the practice of contemplation is developing strength and momentum, then these factors emerge in a way which is leaning towards enlightenment, flowing towards enlightenment. Then they become truly enlightenment factors. Okay, so according to the instructions of the Buddha, the practitioner has to recognize these enlightenment factors when they're present in him, when they're absent in him. Okay, so we begin, we have let me say first, we have 7 factors of enlightenment. Everybody should have received the table. Did anybody come in late and not get the table? So we have 7 factors of enlightenment. Here, mindfulness, investigation of phenomena, energy, rapture, tranquility, concentration, and equanimity. And these factors are set out, the way I would understand it, in a particular order. Again, there's a deliberate sequence in their unfolding. And one begins with mindfulness. And so when one is practicing, especially when one is practicing the 4 establishments of mindfulness, one is already bringing this mindfulness into play. The mindfulness that's going to become an enlightenment factor. But it's when this mindfulness becomes unmuddled, without any obscurity, very sharp and clear, that it becomes a factor of enlightenment. Okay, then, based on this mindfulness, one undertakes what's called the investigation of phenomena. In Pali, it's Dhamma Vicaya. And sometimes, many teachers, basing themselves on the Abhidhamma, explain Dhamma Vicaya, investigation of phenomena, means wisdom or insight. But if we look at the way it's often explained in the text, it doesn't seem to be indicating directly or explicitly that investigation of phenomena is wisdom or insight. But I understand that this is a lower stage of practice, not yet the stage where one has a sharp insight into phenomena. But this is the stage based on mindfulness, where one is investigating phenomena, one is examining them. And the texts often explain that the basis for the investigation of phenomena, we have it here on the table as the principal condition, giving careful attention. That's the yoniso manasikara, giving careful attention to wholesome and unwholesome states of mind, to blameless and faulty states of mind, to bright and dark states. And so the way I see it, based on the initial mindfulness, or as one is examining one's object with mindfulness, different mental states are arising. And one has to be able to distinguish amongst these mental states any unwholesome states and remove them. And then the wholesome mental states that arise, the blameless, bright states, these states one allows to continue and one strengthens them. And so this is the stage where one is actually discriminating the different qualities of the mind in order to understand what are the wholesome states, what are the unwholesome states. And then as part of right effort, one abandons or removes the unwholesome states and strengthens the wholesome states. And as one applies this right effort, then energy arises. That becomes the 3rd factor of enlightenment. One is doing this work with energy. And then as the practice continues, this energy becomes stronger and stronger, so that the whole body and mind seem to be empowered by a dynamo, so that one is very energetic. Okay, now as one is able to contemplate continuously with strong energy, then one experiences some kind of joy that one has never known before. This is what is called rapture, piti. It's a kind of deep joy and bliss that just floods over the body and mind. So this is, it's called niramisa piti. It's a spiritual rapture. But the rapture in itself is a little bit dangerous because it's so blissful and enjoyable that here, as John said, one could develop an attachment to it and then a clinging to it. And when that happens, then one could fall down. But what one has to do is continue just not being pulled, not being led astray by the rapture, but let the rapture just run its course and continue with one's main object of contemplation. As one does so, the rapture subsides and comes to a steady pitch. It's no longer these showering floods of ecstatic bliss, but it's just a steady flood, a steady stream of inner enjoyment, inner bliss, and the mind enters upon a state of tranquility. Everything calms down. The body becomes tranquil. Here I'm reading from this table. The body becomes tranquil and the mind becomes tranquil. When this tranquility sets in, then there comes a deep inner pleasure, inner happiness. And then through that inner happiness, based on that inner happiness, the mind settles down and remains steady on its object. And this is samadhi, concentration. Then as the concentration becomes more focused, builds up strength, then it brings equanimity. And the key word here is upekkha. And it's interesting that in the formula for the 4 jhanas, one has in relation to the second jhana, one experiences the samadhi-jang piti sukham. One experiences the rapture and happiness born of samadhi, born of concentration. But then in description of the 3rd jhana, and especially the 4th jhana, the word upekkha appears. So that the 4th jhana is said to have upekkha sati parisuddhi, purification of equanimity and mindfulness. So it almost seems as if the 6th and 7th bojjhangas are corresponding to the 2nd jhana on the one hand, or maybe the 1st and 2nd jhanas on the one hand, and then with equanimity to the 3rd and 4th jhanas. But in order to be bojjhangas, factors of enlightenment, what brings enlightenment is not the jhana itself, but panya or wisdom. And to me it's a little bit puzzling, my confession, why the bojjhangas culminate in equanimity, not in panya, not in wisdom. To me, that would seem to be the natural order. From this, one might argue that the second Bojjhanga actually is wisdom. But then the question is, why is it in the second place then? Because in other formulas, wisdom comes after samadhi. First, one develops sila, morality. Then, on the basis of moral conduct, one develops samadhi. Then, on the basis of samadhi, one develops panya, wisdom. Okay, I could raise the question. I don't have the answer. Wait, take the microphone.
I always thought wisdom would correspond to the Four Noble Truths, which comes after the seven factors.
Yeah, good point. Actually, we're going to be coming to the Four Noble Truths, and the operative term in relation to the Four Noble Truths is always pajanati, which means one understands, and then that pajanati is related to the noun panya, wisdom. But it's still a question why in the seven factors of enlightenment it would seem natural that they would culminate, to me it seems natural that they would or should culminate in panya, in wisdom. But we have the factor that is usually connected to wisdom coming second.
But if equanimity is the fourth jhana, once we have the equanimity, wouldn't that give us the momentum to push us to panya?
It would, but it's still, to me, it's a little bit of a puzzle why panya is not mentioned explicitly amongst the seven factors of enlightenment. Okay, I want to move on. I don't want to take questions at this point. Okay, so I just went through the sequence of the seven factors of enlightenment. Now, in the Satipatthana Sutta, explaining the method of practice, so how does one dwell contemplating phenomena in terms of the seven enlightenment factors? Here, when there is the mindfulness enlightenment factor, the monk understands there is the mindfulness enlightenment factor in me. When there is no mindfulness enlightenment factor in him, he understands there is no mindfulness enlightenment factor in me. So we'd say that these two steps are the two basic steps in the development of the seven enlightenment factors. When the factor is not present, which logically that should come first, one is aware that this factor is not present in me. Then when the factor arises, then one is aware this factor has arisen in me. If the factor that has arisen for some reason should subside and vanish, one becomes aware again. There is no such factor in me. Okay, but now we come to the second part of the formula, which again introduces this element of conditionality. So we see this element of conditionality introduced in relation to the five hindrances, in relation to the six sense bases, knowing how the fetter arises and is eliminated. And now in the third place, we see it introduced in relation to each of the enlightenment factors. So one understands how the unarisen factor arises and how the arisen mindfulness enlightenment factor comes to fulfillment by development. Here it's not understanding how to abandon the enlightenment factor, because that's not what one wants to do. What one wants to do is to develop the enlightenment factor. So one has to know how to arouse the enlightenment factor and then how to bring it to fulfillment. then in the table that I handed out, we could see certain conditions which are mentioned as conditions for the arising of this enlightenment, of each enlightenment factor. So here it's giving careful attention to things that are a basis for the enlightenment factor of mindfulness. Those things that are the basis for the enlightenment factor of mindfulness would be precisely the four objects of mindfulness: body, feelings, states of mind, or phenomena. At least choosing one of the four bases of mindfulness and using that as the foundation for developing mindfulness. Okay, now this is repeated in relation, let's go back to mindfulness. The commentaries give a number of other factors that are conditions for the arising of each of the enlightenment factors. I'm not going to go through them, but you can just read them on your own. Okay, then we come, in the second place, we come now to the investigation of phenomena enlightenment factor. The condition for its arising is giving careful attention to wholesome and unwholesome states, blameless and faulty states, bright and dark states. Okay, so it's this act of discriminating amongst one's mental states that is the condition for the arising of the investigation of phenomena enlightenment factor. The energy enlightenment factor, okay, the condition for its arising, for its reinforcement, is giving careful attention to what are called the three elements of energy. The element of arousal, the element of endeavor, the element of unstoppable advance. This is a rather free translation. Okay, the text of distinguishing, it's a little bit artificial, but in a general way, you can distinguish three stages in the development of energy. First is the stage when one has to make the effort to arouse energy. This is a stage which sometimes involves struggle, determination, tenacity of purpose. When that energy is aroused and then it's able to function at a steady level with some degree of continuity, this is called the element of endeavor. And then when that element of endeavor builds up force, then it moves on to the third stage in the unfolding of energy. This is called, or it's translated, the element of unstoppable advance, parakama dhatu. It's the stage where one is just, the contemplation of insight is just moving ahead, steadily, unstoppably, boldly, knocking aside any barrier that appears along its course. Okay, so it says to arouse, the condition for the arising of the unarisen energy enlightenment factor is giving careful attention to these three elements of energy. I don't imagine that to develop energy one sits around reflecting what is the element of arousal, what is the element of endeavor, what is the element of advance. But it's rather that, the way I see it, as one is discriminating between the wholesome and the unwholesome states, then one brings forth the energy to remove the unwholesome states and to maintain the wholesome states. So this is giving rise to energy. And then, so that's the element of arousal. And then as the energy moves through these three stages, then one is aware that my energy has now reached this level. Now it's reached that level. Okay, the fourth enlightenment factor, rapture, the factor for the arising of the unarisen enlightenment factor of rapture. The text says the principal condition for the arising of this piti is giving careful attention to things that are a basis for the enlightenment factor of rapture. It seems to me this is a little bit of a cop-out, since it doesn't actually explain what those things are. Then the commentary brings in recollection of the three jewels. Of course, this could be applied in meditation, and it can give rise to rapture. But it seems to me, within the context of the practice of satipatthana, one would not be practicing recollection of the three jewels. I would believe to be giving rise to the factor of rapture, the principal condition would simply be continuing to practice energetically with one's chosen object of meditation within the framework of the Satipatthana system. So whatever one's chosen meditation object is, it could be mindfulness of breathing, in and out breathing, the rise and fall of the abdomen, sensations in the body, the changing states of mind. Whatever it is, one just simply continues with energy to give attention to that. And as one is giving as the attention or mindfulness becomes more sustained, more continuous, then the rapture arises naturally. Okay, then the condition for the arising of unarisen tranquility. The text, the sutta says, giving careful attention to tranquility of body and tranquility of mind. I think we could understand this to mean that as one is practicing energetically, rapture arises, the mind is uplifted by rapture. Okay, if one is not attentive to what is going on, then one could be carried away by this rapture. And one can go into an ecstatic, very blissful, ecstatic state. But it will not be a state which is quieting down and then leading into samadhi, into real samadhi, into the arising of wisdom. But one will be blissed out in some kind of a rapturous diversion from the proper path. And so one has to when this rapture arises, one has to be aware of it as such and recognize that this rapture has arisen. It's enjoyable, it's blissful, but it's also impermanent, unsubstantial. I shouldn't be attached to it. And in this way, by recognizing the rapture as rapture, one is setting up the right conditions for that rapture to settle down, quiet down. And as the rapture settles down, then one experiences this tranquility of body and tranquility of mind. So I would understand that that's what's intended by giving the careful attention to tranquility of body and tranquility of mind. Not allowing oneself to be pulled off the proper course by the experience of rapture, but by recognizing the need to quiet down or to tranquilize the body and mind so it can move into a proper state, proper to contemplation, continued contemplation. Okay, then we come to samadhi, concentration, and the texts give as the principal condition for samadhi, giving careful attention to what is called the samatha nimitta, which means, it's translated, the sign of serenity. And then another expression, I think it's avyapatti nimitta, the sign of non-dispersion or non-destruction. So this means giving continuous, careful attention. Here by sign doesn't necessarily mean this nimitta as the visualized object. The word is not, in the suttas, is not yet used in that sense. But I take nimitta here to mean simply the object of meditation that is intended to bring serenity, to bring samadhi. And so one goes on giving attention to this object of concentration until the mind settles down into a state of non-destruction. Okay, we could take it that this is the enlightenment factor of concentration, could be understood as either the arising of the first, especially the first two jhanas, or else a deep state of concentration, not yet at the level of jhana, but which can be used as a basis for development of insight. Something like the access concentration of the commentaries. Okay, now to move from concentration to equanimity, okay, one needs the condition for the arising of the unarisen enlightenment factor. And I would see this as one is moving through the practice of serenity, that one simply recognizes each of the coarser jhana factors as gross or coarse, and one considers the higher jhana to be superior, and in this way one moves into the higher jhanas until the mind, and as one does so, then the factor of equanimity naturally arises. The texts giving careful attention to things that are a basis for the enlightenment factor of equanimity. What those things are, again, it doesn't explain, it leaves it very general. Perhaps this means that one has to investigate in one's own practice to see what promotes equanimity and what disturbs equanimity. Okay, so in this way one is understanding the factors that give rise to the unarisen enlightenment factors. And then one has to understand how each of these enlightenment factors comes to fulfillment by development. It's in relation to this that these other conditions mentioned in the commentaries are useful. That these are things which are helpful for avoiding the loss of the jhana factors, and things that one could, some of them at least, observe in one's everyday life, which helps to strengthen the enlightenment factors, so that they will eventually be brought to fulfillment. Okay, maybe at this point I will pause and ask whether there's any questions. Whether there are any questions. Okay.
Okay, among these seven factors of enlightenment, is the previous one to be replaced by the one following?
Okay, this is okay.
The piti has to be subsided in order for tranquility to arise. But for the other five factors, it seems to me they continue to exist.
Okay, that's a very good point. The way I would understand it, actually, none of the enlightenment factors actually has to be abandoned for the others to arise. Even piti, excuse me. Well, maybe I have to qualify that. But generally, even piti doesn't have to be abandoned or eliminated for the tranquility to arise. But what happens is that in the early stages, the piti, the rapture, is coarse, and so it's obstructive to tranquility. But as one practices, one has to even though the piti is coarse in the initial stages, still one wants to develop and strengthen that piti, because it's a joyful, blissful state, and so it helps one to solidify the practice. But at a certain point, one will then recognize that the piti, as long as one is attaching the mind to the piti, it's preventing one from going further. And so one doesn't allow oneself to be drawn towards the piti, to be attracted to it and to be attached to it. But one just goes on contemplating one's primary object, even making the deliberate effort. Let the mind settle down, let the body settle down, quiet down. Okay, as one does so, then the piti will subside so that it's no longer in this very intense electrical mode. But now the piti, it's not like, it's not streaming through one like an electric current, but now it's like flowing like, well, let me just change the metaphor. It's no longer streaming through one like a waterfall, like Niagara Falls, but now it's flowing at a rather quiet pace, just like the river after the water is dropped from the waterfall. Then the water of the river just flows on, following the bends and twists of the river at a very even, quiet pace. So the piti is there, but it's just flowing along quietly, somewhat in the background. But the place where I have to qualify this, perhaps, is as one develops from concentration to equanimity. If this really corresponds to a movement from the first two jhanas to the third and fourth jhana, then the piti has to fade out in order to go into the third and fourth jhana. Any further questions? Okay, then I can go very quickly into the section on the Four Noble Truths, since this is given very briefly here. Okay, when the enlightenment factors reach a certain pitch of intensity, then one is able to move into the contemplation with insight, contemplating phenomena. Again, one is contemplating the five aggregates, especially the five aggregates, as being impermanent, suffering, non-self, anicca, dukkha, anatta. And in this way, one is getting a clearer, deeper understanding of the first noble truth, the noble truth of suffering. Since what is the real denotation of the first noble truth? What is it actually referring to? Are the five aggregates bound up with clinging. And so one is contemplating the five aggregates as impermanent, connected with suffering, and as non-self. So one is now practicing the contemplation of the first noble truth. And one also reflects back and tries to see where suffering arises. And one sees how suffering arises from craving. One also sees how the five aggregates arise from life to life, one life to the next, through the causal role of craving. How craving is the cause that brings each set of 5 aggregates into being, from life to life. Okay, now as the insight moves through the different deepening stages of insight, there'll come a point in which the mind turns away from all conditioned phenomena and then penetrates, or you could say it lands on that state which is outside the whole realm of conditioned phenomena. That state outside the realm of all conditioned phenomena is Nibbana, which is the unconditioned. And so just momentarily the mind penetrates through all conditioned phenomena and opens up to the unconditioned, or sees the unconditioned, sees Nibbana. And with that seeing of Nibbana, that is the attainment of stream entry, the first stage of enlightenment. With that experience of the unconditioned, then one understands all 4 Noble Truths. One understands that all of the 5 aggregates make up or bound up with suffering. One understands that craving is the cause of suffering. One has directly realized Nibbana as the cessation or extinction of suffering. And one knows that the Noble Eightfold Path, this is the way to the cessation of suffering. And so in this way one has a direct realization of all 4 Noble Truths. And so one is now understanding the 4 Noble Truths as they really are. So this is the highest stage in the contemplation of Dhammas. One works through first elementary contemplation on the 5 aggregates or the 6 sense bases. Then the 7 enlightenment factors gain momentum. Though their focus, their object is still the 5 aggregates, but they're now joined together as 7 factors of enlightenment. And then when those 7 factors of enlightenment reach a certain depth or peak of intensity, then they lead to the penetration of all 4 Noble Truths. Okay, so in this way one dwells contemplating phenomena and so on. We have the stock formula. And then the sutta ends with a kind of guarantee by the Buddha. He says, if anyone should develop these 4 establishments of mindfulness in this way for 7 years, they can expect one of 2 fruits. Either final knowledge here and now, that's liberation, the state of arhatship in this present life, or if there is still a residue of clinging, a subtle residue of clinging, then one becomes a non-returner, one who takes rebirth in one of the higher realms, never returning to the sensual realm, and then achieving final liberation there. Okay, then let alone 6 years, now the Buddha brings the time frame down from 6 years to 5, 4, 3 to 1 year, then from 1 year to 7 months, 6 months, down to 1 month, then down from 1 month to half a month. One of 2 fruits can be expected, either full liberation here and now, or if there's still some clinging left, one becomes a non-returner. Okay, then finally the Buddha says, let alone half a month, if anyone develops these 4 establishments of mindfulness in this way, even for 7 days, one of these 2 fruits can be expected, either final liberation or non-returning. The Buddha ends with 7 days, but there are some suttas in which somebody comes to the Buddha who's never met the Dhamma before, never practiced, but he gets some guidance, a little guidance, goes off on his own to practice, just practices a few hours and gains the final fruit right then and there. Even the famous case of Bahya Dharacharya, an ascetic named Bahya who came to the Buddha, asked for instruction. The Buddha just gave him a brief statement, and even while he was listening to the Buddha speak, he achieved arhatship right on the spot. But those were people who had all of their faculties were very mature, so they just had to hear the Dhamma or just practice very briefly and they could reach the results. But for those who are a little duller, they have to practice for 7 days. And those who are very dull have to practice for 7 years. But for those of us who are duller than the dull, have to practice 70 years. Okay, this completes the Satipatthana Sutta. Next time we'll do a sutta which illustrates how to practice the 4 foundations of mindfulness with just one meditation object. That's the mindfulness of breathing. Okay, I'm going to have to stop here to go for the lunch, but after the lunch, then I'll come back and then we can have a discussion after lunch. Okay, we'll end with the sharing of the merits. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahedika punyantang anumoditva Chirang rakantu sasanam akasata chabumata deva naga mahedika punyantang anumoditva Chirang rakantu desanam akasata chabumata deva naga mahedika punyantang anumoditva Chirang rakantu mang parang. Next one I'll do in short style. Etavatacha hehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe deva anumodantu sabbe bhutanumodantu sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya pavagupadhaya vichihetato etantare satakayupapanna rupi arupi cha Asanya sanyino Dukha pamuchantu Pusantu nibutin